Hey everyone, Ryan Reagan here with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and thank you so much for joining me for this online video tutorial about ice fishing. Ice fishing is a really great winter activity to get out and enjoy with your friends and your family. In this video tutorial, what we're going to talk about here is we're going to talk about some essential gear that you're going to need to go out and spend a day on the water, and some gear that's, I would say, nice to have, but not necessarily essential. Additionally, we're going to talk about how to target specific species like northern pike, rainbow trout, Arctic char, and landlocked salmon, and burbot. In addition to all of the ice fishing components that are essential to a day on the water, two other key things that I would highly recommend that you ensure that you have at all times on you, and that's first and foremost a valid current year sport fishing license. Sport fishing licenses can be purchased on the ADF&G website, and we'll leave a link in the description to this video so where you can go and get that if you don't have one. And secondarily, a copy of the current year sport fishing regulations. Again, those are available on our website. As well, you can get printed copies at our vendors and your local ADF&G office. So let's talk a little bit about some of the items that are absolutely essential for you to have with you when you're out ice fishing. First and foremost that you're going to want to consider is your personal safety. Your personal safety while ice fishing is obviously one of those central components to going out and spending a day on the water. Some of the things that you're going to want to consider obviously are ice thickness. Now, I'm not going to recommend any type of optimal ice thickness. That is going to come down to your personal preference. My personal preference is that I won't go out and step on the ice unless it's anywhere from 4 to 6 inches thick. Now, others might have a different take on that, and again, that's their prerogative. There are products that you can purchase that will assist you should you fall in, and the best I can say to that is if you want to learn more about this topic, I would encourage you to do a search online for information and products that are available to you. Secondarily, when you're getting ready to go out for a day on the water, consider the fact that you're going to be fishing in colder conditions. So obviously outfitting yourself properly is going to make it a lot more comfortable for you when you're on the water. So a nice winter hat is key. A good set of mittens or gloves is also key. And you can see here I've got a couple different pairs. Now, I use all of these for when I go out, and the one tip I will give is bring more than one pair of gloves or mittens. What I find a lot of times is when I'm out ice fishing, I'm using my bare hands to, get fish out of the water or something like that. And obviously, if you put your wet hands into a set of gloves, the inside of the gloves get wet. So one way I alleviate that problem is I have multiple pairs of gloves. Obviously, good boots, good socks, a good warm outer layer is key to keeping you comfortable while you're on the water. When I'm out ice fishing, this is pretty much what I wear. I wear these bibs. I've got a couple layers underneath here, and most of the time, I'm perfectly comfortable when I'm on the water. When it comes to equipment, there's a couple key essential things that you're going to need to go ice fishing. First and foremost, obviously a way to get through the ice to get to the water. That we'll talk about when we talk about ice augers and spud bars. The second thing you're going to need is an ice rod. Now, you might notice the most obvious difference between an ice fishing rod and, say, an open water fishing rod is the length. Consider that you're not going to use this rod to cast, so therefore you don't need a longer rod to hurl a lure or your line or bait or whatever out into the open water. Ice fishing essentially is you're going to take your hook off, drop it down into the water column and start fishing there. So also you're over a small hole. So if I were to use a larger rod like I would for open water fishing, it would be far less conducive and basically inappropriate for that particular context. So when you go to buy an ice rod, there's a couple things to consider. First and foremost is what you're going to target with that particular rod. Now, for smaller fish, like some fish that you might find in some of the local lakes, including like rainbow trout, landlocked salmon, even Arctic char, you can get away with a lighter tipped rod. This rod right here is designed specifically for ice fishing. It's a 32-inch rod, and it's a medium heavy rod, which means it's got a nice stiff backbone. You can see here that as I bend the tip on that, most of this is going to do the heavy lifting essentially. So if you hook a fish, you're going to fight it, and basically this stronger backbone is going to help you. It's not overkill to have a rod and go, chase smaller fish with. Get one that's going to be versatile. All right, versatility in your ice fishing gear is important if you want to just go out and maybe just buy 1 or 2 rods rather than go buy a slew of rods. When it comes to selecting the appropriate ice auger for you, this is really going to come down to your needs and generally where you're fishing. I've got 2 augers in front of me here. This one here is a gas-powered auger, and this one here is a manual-powered auger. The main difference, obviously, is this one, the power is in the motor. With this one, you're the power. So augers come in various sizes, and what I mean by that is when we look here, we've got a couple of different blades right here, and the width of those blades is going to determine whether it's a 6-inch auger, an 8-inch, or a 10-inch ice auger. And what that means is that's basically going to factor into the circumference of the hole that the auger is capable of drilling. No matter what auger you choose to use, whether it's a manual hand crank ice auger or a gas-powered auger, there's a couple factors to keep in mind here. First and foremost, the blades at the end of these augers are extremely sharp. These are designed to cut through the ice and basically allow you access to the water below the ice. Again, the blades are extremely sharp, so one thing you want to do is don't touch the blades. Most of ice augers will come with a blade cover, so once you remove the blade cover, this is exposed here. And when you go to drill a hole into the ice, you simply place the ice auger, the blades, on top of the ice in a gentle fashion. And with this one, what you're going to do is grab the top of the handle and the side of the handle, and you're going to turn it clockwise. Gas-powered ice augers, in my opinion, are far more efficient to use than a manual hand crank ice auger, partly because this unit does the work for you. You're going to find that it's faster, you're going to exert far less energy, and you can drill a lot more holes in a short amount of time. So with gas-powered augers, you've got an auger head here with a motor on it, and you've got your auger down there, and of course the blades down there at the bottom. So this particular auger happens to be a 2-stroke motor, which means the gas and oil are mixed together and put into this gas container right here. Other augers that are available on the market include electric augers, propane augers. There are 4-stroke augers as well. So depending on what your budget allows, you can explore the options that are out there and find the one that's right for you. Let's talk about tip-ups here for a second. I've got a pretty standard design tip-up here. Now, there are several different styles and brands of tip-ups that are available to ice anglers out there. And while they may look different, the concept and the functionality of them is relatively universally the same. The way a tip-up works is you're going to set this on the ice and walk away, as opposed to if you're using a ice fishing rod. This, in terms of application, is going to allow you to maybe jig, give a little bit more life to, say, an artificial lure. And the tip-up is typically something that you're going to use to place bait to entice the fish. So if there were a hook on this and a leader, what I would do is I would attach bait to it. And when the fish comes along and takes the bait, what happens is it'll turn your spool here, and a flag will indicate that a fish is taking the bait. So this, to the ice angler, would say, okay, we got a flag up, means a fish is taking our bait. Now, the main difference when you go to set the hook on a fish when you're using a tip-up is you're basically going to hand line that fish, whereas if you're using a rod, you could literally just set the hook up, straight up. With these ones, it's a little bit of a different method to hook that fish. So as the fish is going along, or you feel like the fish has that bait and the hook in its mouth, what you'll do is grab the line, yank it real tight, set that hook, and then you're going to fight the fish by pulling the line in. You're not necessarily going to try to get it on this reel and reel it up. It's more or less like you're pulling that line through the hole, feeding it line if it wants it to run. So again, when it comes down to selecting whether or not you're going to use an ice rod or a tip up, there's different applications, and we'll talk about one of the main species that I target using a tip up here in a minute. In addition to your ice fishing rod or your tip up, whatever you're going to go out and target fish with, a couple other key things that you're going to want to have with you. First and foremost, bring a bucket. A bucket serves multiple purposes, but one of the main purposes of the use of a bucket is you can put all of your gear into that bucket and with a handle easily tote it with you. All right, so this here is an ice scoop. An ice scoop is designed to remove the shards of ice that are created when an auger bores through the ice. So once you've drilled your hole with your hand auger or your powered auger, you're going to need to remove those shards of ice from the surface of the water. So for example, if the water was here, I would simply just go in there, scoop, and dump. Ice scoops come in various sizes, but again, the functionality is the same. So I've got a couple different options here to show you. One is plastic, and this one is metal. Now, good thing about this one is it's longer. It's got a deeper scoop on it right here. And if I were to put this in the hole, it would float. Whereas this one, if I were to accidentally drop it down there, I've lost my ice scoop for the day. And I'll have to either fish it out or call it a day and go get another one. Other things to consider too that you're going to want to have with you, a shovel. Now this is just a compact shovel that kind of goes out and in like that, but one of the main reasons you want a shovel is when you're on the water, and if there's snow on the water like we have here, you want to get rid of that snow before you drill the ice hole. A shovel is really one of those essential tools, in my opinion, to have with you when you're going ice fishing. So again, bucket, shovel, ice scoop, ice rod, and or tip up an auger, and you're ready to go. Another essential item I highly recommend that you have with you is a sled. You can have a bucket and put all your stuff in a bucket and carry it like that, but a far better way, a mode of transportation for all of your ice fishing equipment is a sled. This sled here is just a little jet sled, and I've outfitted it with some eye bolts on the side that I use to add tie-down straps or straps to, so when I'm going across a lake or whatnot, I can just pull this along, and it's just great. I can have everything in here. It makes it a lot easier for me to transport all of my ice fishing gear. I want to talk a little bit about just the myriad examples that there are for artificial lures available to ice anglers. Now, some lures that you would use for open water can be applied to ice fishing situations. For example, spoons. Spoons are a great jig to use for larger fish, or larger spoons being used for larger fish, and even smaller spoons for smaller fish, and larger fish will hit a small spoon too. But there's so many options available to you out there. I carry spoons with me depending on the species of fish that I'm targeting. Most of the time when I use larger spoons, I'm using those for northern pike. However, I will use smaller spoons in some of the local stocked lakes, and I've had success on those. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the amount of artificial tackle that's available to you. It can be very daunting if you go into your local store, your bait and tackle store, and you just see rows of ice fishing related equipment. Now, just for simplicity's sake, my experience, if you're just getting into this, you'll start with a small lead head jig. They come in various sizes, and just apply a rubber body to it. Small jig heads are great. As I will mention here, one of my preferred ones is called a Trout magnet, and they're readily available at most stores. They're fairly inexpensive, and if you put just a small piece of bait on there, you're going to find success if you're fishing in the right area. There are other examples of types of jigs that you can use, including tube jigs. Tube jigs are great for various types of species. So for those of you who are out there targeting lake trout, a tube jig is a great jig to use for targeting lake trout. We're not going to talk about targeting lake trout in this video, but if you are one who wants to pursue lake trout through the ice, I would recommend that. Again, there's a lot of research that can be done on there. Maybe go with somebody. If you've never been for lake trout, go with somebody who has been. And also, if you're just getting started out ice fishing, I would recommend not making lake trout your first primary target, but start small. So start at a local stock lake and work your way up, as there is a little bit more of a learning curve when you're going after lake trout. A key question you're going to run into when you start really getting into ice fishing, or even just briefly getting into ice fishing, is you're going to hear a lot of discussions about the use of electronics. Now, electronics are, it's a broad term for basically some things that are available to ice anglers, which would include flashers, depth sounders, cameras. So for the purposes of this video, I've used all manner of electronics, and I will tell you that one of my key go-to things, electronics that I use, is a flasher. Now, the question will come up, like, are electronics really worth it? And if you ask me, I will absolutely say yes. And having said that, I've used cameras and depth sounders and of course flashers. My preferred electronic that I carry with me all the time when I'm ice fishing is this flasher right here. And the way a flasher works is it's essentially a real-time fish finder, but it also serves to show you the depth of the water column. So from the underneath of the ice down to the bottom, it reads in real time. And I would turn this one on if we were, and demonstrate it if we were on a location that actually had enough ice on it. I could drop it down and show you what it looked like. But there's a little bit of a learning curve when you get these, but it's an on the water learning curve. And once you get it down, they're super, super easy. So the way these work is you've got a transducer, which is this thing right here. And when you're on an open ice hole like that, you essentially just want to drop your transducer onto the bottom portion of that ice right there. You don't necessarily need to drop it super deep in there. I like to keep mine just about a couple inches below the bottom of the ice. And the reason being is this shoots impulses down to the bottom, and it will kind of show you like I said, the depth. But when a fish comes in, you'll see it on this one. This one has this little dial right here, and these electronic colors will show up in there. And again, it'd be a lot easier to show you if I actually had something, but there's a lot of videos on YouTube about the use of a flasher, and if you had any interest in that, check it out. My main point is, a flasher, in my opinion, is one of those essential things that you're going to want to use when you're ice fishing. As you can see, I've got my ice fishing tent set up behind me here. These tents are great. They work for the main purpose of just keeping you warm when you're on the ice. So what these do is they're super easy to set up. You drill your holes, clear your spot out, you set this tent up, and this acts as a wind barrier. It kind of keeps the heat inside, and it's just a great thing to have. However, in my opinion, not an essential item. Now, in addition to this tent, you can include with it a little propane heater. This happens to be a buddy heater, and you fire this up, put it in here, and you can be extremely comfortable while on the ice. Now, again, in my opinion, having used these and having fished on the ice with really no shelter, I find that especially where I fish down here in South Central, if it's going to be really cold, then perhaps I'll take this and I'll go and put it up. But again, just starting out, you might not need to consider this as one of those absolutely essential must-have items to get out and go and enjoy a day on the water. Another way to get through the ice is with a spud bar. This here is a spud bar, and at the end here we've just got kind of a sharpened edge, and this sharpened edge is used to punch through the ice. Now, I consider this more of a non-essential item because primarily your auger is going to be the number one tool that you're going to use to drill a hole through the ice. Now, considerably speaking, these spud bars are much cheaper than an auger is, but in these spud bars, they're more or less dependent upon how thick the ice is going to come in to your benefit or not. So if you're trying to go through a real thick portion of ice, a spud bar's, you know, it's not really the best thing to do. However, if you're out set lining for burbot, after you drill your ice holes and put your set lines in, sometimes you come back the next day and the hole's slightly got a coat of ice over it. A spud bar is great to get through. So again, if you're going to set line for burbot, consider getting a spud bar. But if you're just doing general ice fishing, keep with that auger. Let's talk a little bit about ice fishing for northern pike. I really enjoy getting out in South Central and targeting pike through the ice. It's one of my preferred fish to go for. And as I've mentioned before, 9 times out of 10 when I go ice fishing for pike, I set tip-ups. I've got a tip-up set up right here to demonstrate to you how to effectively go out and target northern pike. But I want to say a couple things about the depth about when you're targeting pike. So pike are typically going to be found in shallower water. So I've caught pike in 6 inches of water, and I normally do not fish for pike in water that's deeper than 12 feet. That's just me. Now, if you have different experiences with that and you're catching pike a little deeper, please let us know in the comment section and share some of your tips and information. I've got a herring right here, a frozen herring. Now, when I'm out targeting pike, herring and hooligan are the 2 baits that I use when targeting pike. Now remember, in the freshwaters of Alaska, you cannot use live bait. So if you get some frozen herring or frozen hooligan, this is a very effective pike bait. Now when you're rigging these, there's a couple things to consider here. First and foremost, the size of the bait that you're going to actually offer the fish. So depending on where I'm fishing for pike, if I know there's real big pike in there, a lot of times what I'll do is I will use a whole herring like this. This is, we call these just blue label herring. You can get these at most of your big box bait and tackle stores. And the setup I use for northern pike for tip-ups is I've got here a treble hook connected to a wire leader. Wire leader is essential when you're fishing for pike because they've obviously got very sharp teeth and their teeth will fray the line while you're fighting them. So if I were going to rig this particular herring up with this particular treble hook, what I would do is I would come in with one hook right above the dorsal fin of this herring. And you can see the reason that I do this is I like to give this fish as much of a natural presentation as I possibly can. So as I drop it down here into this fake ice hole, if this was an actual fishing situation, most of the time when I'm fishing for pike, I put the bait just either right under the ice or a couple inches under the ice. Specifically too, if I'm over a weed bed, I might even drop it down into the weeds a little bit. But as you can see, this setup right here would be adequate for me for a setup for pike. Now there are areas in the state of Alaska, especially in South Central, which would allow an angler to use 5 lines to target northern pike. So check your regulations to be sure that when you're ice fishing, you want to make sure if you're going to target pike that you're using the full allowable number of lines. So for example, by definition, sport fishing through the ice can be conducted with the use of no more than 2 lines. However, if you're targeting pike in certain areas, in areas that we refer to as a 5-line lake, one angler can use up to 5 lines to target pike. So again, check your regulations to make sure that when you're targeting pike, you can use 5 lines. You don't have to use a whole herring or hooligan to target pike. In fact, bait conservation, especially out on the ice, is always a good idea. So when I'm going out and setting up a spread for northern pike, I'll vary the amount of bait that I put on my hooks. So like I said, sometimes I'll use a full one just to kind of see. Sometimes I'll even use just a portion of the tail. And one thing I want to point out is when you're using a full chunk of, or a big piece of bait like this, especially for pike, when a pike hits this, sometimes what they'll do is they'll grab it on the side and swim away with it. Or sometimes they'll grab it by the head and swim away with it. But if it's a big piece like this, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll grab that and they'll run with it. So you might, as an angler, you might see your flag go up and you might come running over to your hole and look down and you can see that spool's just spinning and spinning and spinning. And if a pike is taking that, what it's likely doing is just moving, swimming with the fish, with the bait in its mouth. And a lot of times what they'll do when they do that is they'll swim for a certain distance, they'll stop, and they'll reposition the bait to where it's basically going with your bait head first into their mouth. And then they kind of swallow it, and then they'll move on. So one common mistake people do when using tip-ups to target pike is they'll pull the hook too early. They'll come running over to their tip-up, and they'll see that line is just flying off the spool, and they get really excited, and they'll pull this out of the water, grab the line and set the hook, and all they're doing is just yanking that bait and that hook out of the pike's mouth. So if you're using a big chunk of bait, be sure that you're giving that pike adequate time to ingest the fish, the bait. That way you know the hook's in there and you can get a good solid setup. Now if you're using a smaller chunk, such as a little tail like this, so if a fish comes along and takes that and that flag goes up, and I know that there's a smaller chunk of bait on that, I might be more inclined, as that fish is swimming away, to think that hook's probably in its mouth. I'm gonna go ahead and set it. I wish I had the tried and true method to say wait for X number of seconds or whatever before you try pulling that out there and setting the hook, but I've not found the key formula for it. If I did, I'd share it with you. But pike fishing with tip-ups is a ton of fun. Now, you don't have to target pike using tip-ups. If you don't have tip-ups, that's fine. You can use your ice fishing rod to target them. What you see here is I've got a larger style spoon here connected with a leader. This is the main thing. Again, you want to really be considerate of the fact that pike have exceptionally sharp teeth, and they will fray braid, they will fray monofilament line quite easily. So I use these wire leaders. And if I were fishing for pike with this particular rig, again, just dropping it down the hole, I like to give a lot of jigging action, and then marked by periods of just not doing anything, just leaving it there. So I might jig for a couple of seconds real actively and just kind of let it sit. And I've done this with this type of lure, and you can add bait to it too. You can add a little chunk of herring if bait's permitted where you're fishing, and and just kind of go that way. Whether you're using ice fishing rod or a tip-up for pike, they're just a lot of fun. And again, be sure to check your regulations. In areas of South Central Alaska, they are an invasive species and they can't be returned to the water alive. But in other parts of the state, that's not the case. So again, be sure to check your regulations. When you go fishing into local lakes, especially around Anchorage or the Mat-Su, or even up in the interior, the local stock lakes, that is, many of our lakes are stocked with rainbow trout, landlocked salmon, Arctic char, just to name a few of the species that you're going to find in some of our stocked lakes. When you're ice fishing for them, you've got a great variety of lakes across the road system and across the state that offer some pretty exceptional fishing for these fish. Now, while there's a lot of offerings and artificial lures and whatever on the market that you can use to go out and target these fish, I'll show you some of the setups that I like to use that have proven successful to me. And first and foremost, when I go out and target fish at any stock lake, my first go-to is called a trout magnet. Now, a trout magnet is basically a small weighted jig head with a rubber body attached to it. These bodies come in various colors, but primarily the sizes that I found have all remained the same. So my preferred color when I go out is orange or a combination of white and pink. And not to say that this is the only thing that I will use when out fishing for any species of fish like rainbows or Arctic char or landlocked salmon. It's what I start with. And in addition to the trout magnet, what I like to do is I like to put a little piece of shrimp on the hook. I use this pink cured shrimp here, and this is sold at most big box bait and tackle stores. You can also probably find it at your local sporting goods outlet. And basically what it is just cocktail shrimp that's been dyed and cured. And you'll find it in the freezer. So when you get these, a couple things that I'll tell you about this stuff here is what you want to do before you actually go out and start using this stuff is you want to thaw it out. And if you keep it in your freezer in the morning of you're going fishing and you haven't thawed it out the night before, that's okay. Because what you can do is you can reach into your cup here of bait and you can pull out a small piece and stick it in your hand and just let it thaw out for a few minutes before threading it onto the hook. Now this stuff really, in my experience, doesn't stay on the hook extremely well if it's frozen. So that's why I suggest thawing it out before you use it. But again, this you don't really need a big piece of this stuff. A lot of people when they're using this kind of shrimp or whatever, they want to grab a full chunk and put it on there. Trust me when I say that I've caught some really nice fish, very nice rainbow trout in some of the local lakes up in the Matsu Valley on a trout magnet and a very small chunk of shrimp. Additionally, you could also try to use cured salmon roe. Again, this is bait that I purchased at one of my local box stores here. And it's basically just cured salmon roe. I also cure my own roe, but for this application, I don't mind going to the store and buying this stuff here, as I found that a lot of the fish in these lakes, they'll hit this stuff. Now, again, you don't want to use a large chunk of this cured roe. You simply want to remove a small portion and put it onto your hook. I will say with this stuff, sometimes it, again, much like the shrimp, doesn't like to stay on the hook extremely well. So bait checks are often a good idea, especially if you're jigging. If you're jigging your offering up and down, a lot of times what will happen is over time, your bait will simply just fall off. So you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on that. You can also use those individual fireball eggs, or they come in these little glass containers. You can just simply thread one of those onto your hook. My experience with those is I have a higher success rate utilizing shrimp or cured salmon roe than I do utilizing those little eggs. But again, experiment with this stuff. This is just about learning. It's about finding what works for you on that particular day. When I approach an opportunity to go out and fish for locally stocked species like rainbows, Arctic char, landlocked salmon, stuff like that, and I have my trout magnet with a small piece of shrimp on it here, what I'm looking for first and foremost in the water column is depth and structure. Bathymetric maps are a great resource for you to learn a lake that you're unfamiliar with. Go to the ADF&G website, find a local lake, do your research before going out to the lake. That's going to help you be a lot more successful. So if I'm at my particular location, I found a location that I want to start at on the lake. If I'm targeting rainbows or any of those other species that I've already mentioned, typically what I'll do is I'll start in water that's anywhere from 5 feet to about 16 feet is about as deep as I'll go on that. And a lot of times what I'll do is, because I can use two rods while I'm ice fishing, I'll have one in a shallow location and one in a deeper location. And in doing that, what I've done is I've taken and I've used my electronics and of course my gas-powered auger, and I've drilled a long line of holes that basically, if we can imagine, go that spread out across a small section of the lake, and they follow the contours of the declining slope under the water. So what I do is I'll have one maybe at 5 or 6 feet, and then maybe I'm fishing one at 16 feet. And when I'm targeting these species, what I like to do is I like to drop the offering all the way to the bottom and then reel it up a couple of cranks. So it's basically a couple of inches or maybe even a foot off of the bottom of the substrate. So unlike pike, how we talked about earlier, where pike, I like to fish them just directly beneath the bottom of the ice. Rainbows and other species like that, I tend to think that they're on the bottom searching for forage foods, especially in areas where there's a high level of crustaceans or maybe even stickleback, which is a small bait fish, especially over weed beds. You're going to find where you find the food, you're going to find the fish, right? It makes sense. So when I'm using this, that's another key thing to do is just vary your spread up a little bit. If one hole's not working, try a different one. Another point, if you've never gone to a particular location before and you're really just, you don't even know where to start, one thing you can do is take a minute and walk around the lake a little bit, starting from the shoreline. Don't go directly into the middle and start walking around. Walk around the shoreline a little bit. And what you're going to do is you're going to look for old ice holes, which are basically, you can't miss them. They're basically just, holes with an 8 to 10 inch diameter with a bunch of snow and ice on it. That's an indication that people have been fishing there before. And one thing to do is go around and look and see if you see any bait, anything like that. Sometimes there's even blood. If people are pulling fish out of the water, keeping fish, those fish might bleed on the ice. That's a good indication. That's a starting point for you. Now, when I'm fishing for species like rainbows, Arctic char, landlocked salmon, stuff like that, my main rod setup is just a light reel. I've got anywhere from 6 to 8 pound test line. I'm not really going too heavy on the line. I will say that there are some lakes in the Mat-Su Valley specifically where you can really find some very nice rainbow trout. And if you're going after some bigger fish, you might want to bump up the line a little bit to maybe like a 10-pound test, or at minimum, I think if you're going after some larger trout, especially in those areas, a minimum of 8-pound test line would be applicable. And before you start fishing, it's always a really good idea to check your drag. I like to set my drag a little bit loose, so if I hook a fish and it starts running, the drag is just going to, the fish won't be encumbered enough to potentially break the line. So before you start fishing, be sure to check the drag. And you have a little drag knob at the top of your reel here that you can twist, tighten down, or loosen up. And you can just simply give your line a nice pull. So you can always tighten your drag as you're fighting a fish, but it's tough and you might regret it if you lose a fish due to the fact that your drag was too tight to begin with. I gotta say, set lining for burbot is one of my favorite things to do through the ice. When I was living in Fairbanks, I did a lot of it on the Tanana River. It's a really great location. So if you're up in the interior, up in Fairbanks specifically, and you want to try set lining for burbot, the Tanana is a great place to start. Now, set lining is a lot different than utilizing tip-ups or your standard ice fishing rod. A set line is basically constructed with the intent to drop bait down to the bottom of a lake or a river or wherever you're fishing and leave it sitting there unattended overnight, specifically for burbot is the way to go with that. So set lines, there's some regulatory parameters that require an angler to put their name and address and some whatnot on their gear that they're using. So what I'm holding right here is an example of a burbot set line. So you can see here, this is just a standard piece of pine wood, and what I've done is I've drilled a hole through the middle and I've attached about 20 feet of line here. Now you can use basically 550 cord or P cord, whatever, any type of stronger line. Don't wrap this up with like a bunch of fishing line or any type of line that might float. And stronger but thin is always a good option when you're creating your burbot set lines. I will say that there is a great couple videos on our YouTube channel here from our staff up in Fairbanks who did an exceptional job showing the process of set lining for burbot. So they go into far more detail than I will on this video, and I encourage you, if you're going to go do any type of set lining, whether it's on the Tanana or in another location, really go check those videos out because they are super good, and you probably will learn a lot more. But for me, this is a pretty standard setup here. So as you can see here, that's an 8 ounce weight. I simply what I do with that is I come up maybe a couple of feet from my weight, and I do an overhand loop knot here just to create it in the line here to create this little loop right here, and then I thread on a swivel. The purpose of doing this, and I have an open swivel here, the purpose of doing that is I've also, in addition to this, when I create my set lines for Burbot, again, you want to check your regulations, but in certain areas you're allowed a certain number of hooks per angler. So for example, if the regulations allow me to use up to 5 hooks or even up to 15 hooks, what I might do is either put 1 hook on every set line, or maybe sometimes I'll put 2 hooks on each set line. Again, just check your regulations to make sure that you're in accordance and in compliance with the law. But a lot of times what I'll do is I'll have my set line created here with the weight, and I'll leave the swivel on it right here. And then what I've got here is I'll wrap up a bunch of these leaders, and this is just one of those little pool noodles, but this becomes a pretty handy hook carrier. So when I'm ready to go and set up my my Burbot set, what I'll do is just take this mono leader and just thread that on and bait the hook, and I'm ready to go. As far as a hook choice goes for Burbot, the way Burbot feed is they'll basically grab the bait and just swallow it right there. So that's why set lines are so effective for Burbot fishing. When a Burbot bites that hook, it essentially the hook sets itself. So you can get away with using a larger gapped hook. This is probably a 6 or 7/0 hook that I use. And what I like to do is I like to use an egg loop knot here, because this is how I kind of secure some bait, better secure bait right there. And if you want to know how to tie an egg loop knot, we've got another video here on our YouTube channel that you can check that out. It's a fairly easy process. There's a little bit of a learning curve there, but once you get it down, it's good to go. So, but point being, I've only got about 18 inches of leader material here, and this is about a 30-pound monofilament leader that I'm running from my main line on my set line here. And I'll grab a piece of bait and we'll put some on here. As far as what I would recommend for bait when you're going for Burbot, herring is a good option. It's pretty readily available year-round in your local bait and tackle stores. Hooligan is a good one. And lamprey eel. If you can get lamprey eel, that's probably my favorite bait to use for Burbot fishing, especially on the Tanana. But it works in various other locations as well. So lamprey, that's a tip for you. And when I'm out fishing for or setting up set lines for Burbot, that's about the size of bait I use, maybe even a little bit smaller. But as I mentioned, I'll use that egg loop, open that egg loop up, thread the tail in there, cinch that down, and then just run the hook through there. So again, I've got a nice setup right here, and if a Burbot were to come along, grab that, essentially what it would do is it would just swallow the whole thing, and then it would swim away, and that hook would be penetrated inside of the fish. So I like to bury my hook a little bit and giving enough of that point exposed to where once it's actually in the fish's throat or stomach and it swims away, there's no chance that hook's coming out. Now, I have been asked in the past before if I use circle hooks for Burbot. I've experimented using circle hooks. I think it's a great idea, because part of the thing is once you go to check your set lines for Burbot, if you've got a fish on there, that hook is oftentimes lodged very far down the fish, that you essentially just have to take your leader off and put a new one on there and then go home, and when you're cleaning the fish, then you can pull the hook out. Circle hooks, though, for me, I've had it go both ways. I've had some that actually won't lodge inside and will effectively lodge on the in the corner of the mouth, as a circle hook is known to do. Other times, though, it doesn't matter. The hook just gets lodged inside of them, and that's how it goes. So I don't mind using octopus J hooks when targeting Burbot. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us here in this video tutorial on ice fishing I truly do hope that the information presented in this video is beneficial to you. The main thing is to be encouraged to get out and go ice fishing. Ice fishing is a great recreational activity that you can enjoy in the long Alaskan winters. If you've enjoyed this video and you feel like we've earned it, please subscribe to the channel. We're constantly working to update and include more beneficial information for anglers like you, to include how-to videos, cooking videos. There's a lot of great stuff going on our YouTube channel, so please like and subscribe.